Make sure to check out the previous video in this series, link in the description. Chapter 4. I'm so happy you came, Reginald Clarke said as he conducted Ernest into his studio. It was a large, luxuriously furnished room overlooking the Hudson and Riverside Drive. Dazzled and bewildered, the boy's eyes wandered from object to object, from picture to statue. Despite seemingly incongruous details, the whole arrangement possessed style and distinction. A satyr on the mantelpiece whispered obscene secrets into the ears of Saint Cecilia. The argent limbs of Antonius brushed against the garments of Mount Lisa, and from a corner a little rococo lady peered coquettously at the grey image of an Egyptian sphinx. There was a picture of Napoleon facing the image of the crucifix. Above all, in this semi-darkness artificially produced by heavy drapiers, towered two busts, Shakespeare and Balzac. Ernest exclaimed with some surprise. Yes, explained Reginald, they are my gods. His gods? Surely there was a key to Clarke's character. Our gods are ourselves, raised to the highest power. Clarke and Shakespeare? Even to Ernest's admiring mind, it seemed almost blasphemous to name a contemporary, however esteemed, in one breath with the mighty master of song, whose great gaunt shadow thrown against the background of the years has assumed immense, improportionate, monstrous dimensions. Yet something might be said for the comparison. Clarke undoubtedly was universally broad and undoubtedly concealed, with no less exquisite taste than the Elizabethan. His own personality under the splendid raiment of his art. They certainly were affinities. It would not have been surprising to him to see the clear, calm head of Shakespeare rise from behind his host. Perhaps, who knows, the very presence of the bust in his room had, to some extent, subtly and secretly moulded Reginald Clarke's life. A man's soul, like the chameleon, takes colour from its environment. Even comparative trifles, the number of the house in which we live or the colour of the wallpaper of a room, may determine a destiny. The boy's eyes were again surveying the fantastic surroundings in which he found himself, while, from a corner, Clarke's eyes were watching his every movement, as if to follow his thoughts into the innermost labyrinth of the mind. It seemed to Ernest, under the spell of this passing fancy, as though each vase, each picture, each curio in the room was reflected in Clarke's work. In a long-queued porcelain Chinese mandarin, he distinctly recognized a quaint curtain in one of Clarke's most marvelous poems, and he could have sworn that the grin of the Hindu monkey god on the writing table had appeared in the weird rhythm of two stanzas whose grotesque cadence had haunted him for years. At last, Clarke broke the silence. "You like my studio?" he asked. The simple question brought Ernest back to reality. Like it? Why, it's stunning. It set up in me the queerest train of thought. Yes, I too have been in a whimsical mood tonight. Fancy, unlike genius, is an infectious disease. What is the peculiar form it assumed in your case? I've been wondering whether all the things that environ us day by day are, in a measure, fashioning our thought life. I sometimes think that even my little Mandarin and this monkey idol, which, by the way, I brought from India, are exerting a mysterious but nonetheless real influence upon my work. Great God, Ernest replied. I have had the identical thought. How very strange, Clarke exclaimed, with seeming surprise. It is said, tritely but truly, that great minds travel the same roads, Ernest observed, inwardly pleased. No, the older man subtly remarked. But they reach the same conclusion by a different route. And you attach serious importance to our fancy. Why not? Clarke was gazing abstractedly at the bust of Balzac. A man's genius is commensurate with his ability of absorbing from life the elements essential to his artistic completion. Balzac possessed this power in a remarkable degree. But strange to say, it was evil that attracted him most. He absorbed it as a sponge absorbs water, perhaps because there was so little of it in his own makeup. He must have purified the atmosphere around him for miles, by bringing all the evil that was floating in the air or slumbering in men's souls to the point of his pen. And his eyes were resting on Shakespeare's features, as a man might look upon the face of a brother. He, too, was such a nature. In fact, he was the most perfect type of artist. Nothing escaped his mind. From life and from books, he drew his material, each time reshaping it with a master hand. Creation is a divine prerogative. Recreation, infinitely more wonderful than mere calling into existence, is the prerogative of the poet. Shakespeare took his colours from many palettes. That is why he is so great, and why his work is incredibly greater than he. It alone explains his unique achievement. Who was he? What education did he have? What opportunities? None. And yet we find in his work the wisdom of Bacon, Sir Walter Raleigh's fancies and discoveries, Marlowe's verbal thunders, and the mysterious loveliness of Mr. W.H. Ernest listened, entranced by the sound of Clarke's maleficent voice. He was, indeed, a master of the spoken word, and possessed a miraculous power of giving to the wildest fancies an air of resemblance. Chapter 5. Yes, said Walkham the sculptor. It is a most curious thing. What is? Asked Ernest, who had been dreaming over the Sphinx that was looking at him from its corner with the sarcastic smile of 5,000 years. How our dreams of yesterday stare at us like strangers today. On the contrary, remarked Reginald, it would be strange if they were to still know us. In fact, it would be unnatural. The skies above us and the earth underfoot are in perpetual motion. Each atom of our physical nature is vibrating with unimaginable rapidity. Change is identical with life. It sometimes seems, said the sculptor, as if thoughts evaporate like water. Well, why not? Under favourable conditions. But where would they go? Surely they cannot perish utterly. Yes, that is the question. Or rather, it is not a question. Nothing is ever really lost in the spiritual universe. But what, inquired Ernest, is the particular reason for your reflection?" "It is this," the sculptor replied. "I had a striking motive, and I lost it." "Do you remember," he continued, speaking to Reginald, "the Narcissus I was working on the last time you called by my studio?" Yes. It was a striking thing. It impressed me very much, though I cannot seem to recall it at the moment." "Well, it was a commission. An eccentric young millionaire had offered me $8,000 to make it for him. I had an absolutely original conception, but I cannot execute it. It is as if a breeze had carried it away." "Oh, that is very regrettable." "Oh, I should say so," replied the sculptor. Ernest smiled. For everybody knew of Walkman's domestic troubles. Having twice figured in the divorce court, he was at present defraying the expenses of 3 households. The sculptor had meanwhile seated himself at Reginald's writing table, unintentionally scanning a typewritten page that was lying before him. Like all artists, something of a madman and something of a child, he had first glanced over its contents distractedly. Then, with an interest so intense that he was no longer aware of the impropriety of his action. "By Jove!" he cried. "What is this?" "It's an epic of the French Revolution," Reginald replied with little surprise. "But, man, do you know that I have discovered my motive in it?" "What do you mean?" asked Ernest, looking first at Reginald and then at Walkham, whose sanity he began to doubt. "Listen!" And the sculptor read, trembling with emotion, a long passage whose measured cadence delighted Ernest's ear, without, however, enlightening his mind as to the purport of Walkham's cryptic remark. Reginald said nothing, but the gleam in his eye showed that this time, at least, his interest was alert. Walkham saw the hopelessness of making clear his meaning without an explanation. Sorry, I forget that you haven't a sculptor's mind. I am so constructed that with me, all impressions are immediately transformed into the sense of form. I do not hear music, I see it rise with domes and spirals, with painted windows and arabesques. The scent of a rose is to me tangible. I can almost feel it with my hand. So your prose suggested to me, by its rhythmic flow, something which at first indefinite crystallized finally into my lost conception of Narcissus." "It is extraordinary," murmured Reginald. "I had not dreamed of it." "So you do not think it's rather fantastic?" remarked Ernest, circumscribing his true meaning. No, it is quite possible. Perhaps his Narcissus was entering the subconscious of my mind whilst I was writing this passage. And surely it would be strange if the undercurrent of our mind were not reflected in our style. Do you mean then that a subtle psychologist ought to be able to read beneath and between our lines, not only what we express, but also what we have left unexpressed? Oh, undoubtedly. Even if, while we are writing, we are unconscious of our state of mind. Of course. That would open a new field of psychology. Only to those that have the key, that can read the hidden symbols. It is to me, a master of course, that every mind movement below or above the threshold of consciousness must, of a necessity, leave its imprint, faintly or clearly as the case may be, upon our activities. Well, this may explain why books that seem intolerably dull to the majority delight the hearts of the few. Ernest interjected. Yes, to the few that possess the key. I distinctly remember how an uncle of mine once laid down a discussion on higher mathematics and blushed fearfully when his innocent wife looked over his shoulder. The man who had written it was a roux. Then the seemingly most harmless books may secretly possess the power of scattering in young minds the seed of corruption, Walcom remarked. If they happen to understand, Clarke observed thoughtfully. I can very well conceive of a lecturer's textbook of calculus, or of a reporter's story of a picnic in which burnt under the surface, undiscoverable, save to the initiate, the tragic passion of Tristan and Isolde. Chapter 6. Several weeks had elapsed since the conversation in Reginald Clarke's studio. The spring was now well advanced, and had sprinkled the meadows with flowers, and the bookshelves of the reviewers with fiction. The latter Ernest turned to good account, but from the flowers no poem blossomed forth. In writing about other men's books, he almost forgot that the springtide had brought to him no bouquet of song. Only now and then, like a rippling of water, disquietude troubled his soul. The strange personality of the master of the house had enveloped his thoughts with an impenetrable maze. The day before, Jack had come on a flying visit from Harvard, but even he was unable to free Ernest's soul from the obsession of Reginald Clarke. Ernest was lazily stretching himself on a couch, waving the smoke of his cigarette to Reginald, who was writing at his desk. Your friend Jack is delightful, Reginald remarked, looking up from his papers. And his ebon-coloured hair, why, it contrasts perfectly with the gold in yours. Why, I should imagine that you two are temperamental antipodes. So we are, but friendship bridges the chasm between us. How long have you known him? Oh, we have been chums ever since our sophomore year. Well, what attracted you to him? It is no simple manner to define exactly someone's likes and dislikes. Even a tiny protoplastic animal appears to be big and complex under a microscope. How can we hope to analyze with any degree of certitude our souls, especially when, under the influence of feeling, we see as through a glass, darkly? Yes, Esther, it is true that personal feeling colours our spectacles and distorts the perspective. Still, we should not shrink from self-analysis. We must learn to see clearly into our own hearts if we would give vitality to our work. Indiscretion is the better part of life, nature, and it behooves us to hound down each delicate, elusive shadow of emotion and convert it into copy. It is because I am so self-analytical that I realize the complexity of my nature and am at a loss to define my emotions. Conflicting forces sway us hither and thither without neutralizing each other. Psychology isn't physics, Reginald. There were many things to attract me to Jack. He was subtler, more sympathetic, more feminine, perhaps, than the rest of my college mates. That I have noticed. In fact, his lashes are those of a girl. You still care for him very much? It isn't a matter of caring. We are two beings that live one life. Ah, a sort of psychic Siamese twin. Almost. Why, the matter is very simple. Our hearts root in the same soil. The same books have nourished us. The same great winds have shaken our being. And the same sunshine called forth the beautiful blossoms of friendship. Yes, well, He struck me, if you will pardon my saying so, as a rather commonplace companion. There is in him a hidden sweetness, and a depth of feeling which only intimate contact reveals. He's now taking his postgraduate course at Harvard, and for well nigh 2 months we have not met, yet so many invisible threads of common experience unite us that we could meet after years and still be near to each other. Oh, you are very young, Reginald replied. What do you mean? Never mind. So you do not believe that 2 hearts may ever beat as one? No. That is an auditory delusion. Not even 2 clocks beat in unison. There is always a discrepancy. Infinitesimal perhaps, but a discrepancy nonetheless. A sharp ring of the bell interrupted the conversation. A moment later, a curly head popped through the door. "Hello, Ernest. How are you, old man?" the intruder cried with a laugh in his voice. Then, noticing Clarke, shook hands with the great man, unceremoniously, with the nonchalance of the healthy young animal bred in the atmosphere of an American college. His touch seemed to thrill Clarke, who breathed heavily, and then turned to face the window, as if to conceal the flush of vitality on his cheek. It was a breath of springtide that Jack had brought with him. Youth is a prince charming. To shriveled veins, the pressure of his hand imparts a spark of animation, and middle age unfolds its petals in his presence as a sunflower gazing at late noon once more upon its lord. "I've come to take Ernest away from you," said Jack. "He looks a little paler than usual, and I'm sure a day's outing will stir the red corpuscles in his blood." "I have no doubt that you will take good care of him," Reginald replied. "Where shall we go?" Ernest asked absent-mindedly. But he did not hear the answer, for Reginald's skepticisms had more deeply impressed him than he cared to confess to himself. G'day guys, I hope you enjoyed that story and thank you so much for giving it a listen. Remember, if you want some more scary stories, you can go to the Scary Stories for Late Nights playlist. Dusk Bowl has been a fantastic project to work on, and remember, if you've got any fanfic or fan art or any just questions about the series, feel free to email me at duskbowl.fm@gmail.com. I love every single one of you, and you've made being a microtuber probably one of the best experiences of my life. I want to give special thanks to my patrons, of course, being Lady Nevermore, Sculpt Queen, Catherine Gordon, The Curator, and Stephen Stevens. If you see them in the comments, please say g'day. And to all of you, I bid you logs of love and shit shivers.